Under Article 59 of the Kenyan Constitution, the Commission on Administrative Justice, or the CAJ, serves as the official national ombudsman. It is the primary watchdog tasked with investigating maladministration and protecting the public from bureaucratic abuse. To execute this mandate, the CAJ is granted specific statutory tools. It can issue legal summons, demand the production of internal government documents, and formally recommend remedies whenever it uncovers a violation of constitutional rights. But a watchdog is only effective if the targets of its investigations actually comply. Across the country, state and county officers are actively ignoring the CAJ's subpoenas, dismissing the Commission's directives as legally non-binding. When the CAJ attempted to investigate complaints against judicial officers, they issued formal summons to the Judicial Service Commission, or JSC. The commissioner simply ignored the subpoenas, labeling them unlawful and unwarranted. The root of this defiance traces back to a previous Supreme Court ruling known as the Vision 2030 Delivery Board case. In that decision, the court categorized the CAJ's recommendations as discretionary, meaning government agencies are not legally forced to implement them. Without the power to enforce its own rulings, the CAJ found itself paralyzed. To restore its authority, the Commission decided it needed a radical judicial intervention to rewrite the rules of compliance. The CAJ initiated a high-stakes legal maneuver, filing reference E001 of 2025 directly to the Supreme Court. They invoked Article 163(6), a constitutional provision that allows state organs to request an advisory opinion from the apex court. Their primary objective was to force the Supreme Court to overturn its own precedent. They argued that the Vision 2030 case was decided parent curiam, a legal term meaning the judgment was made without reference to the correct statutory law. By throwing out that precedent, the CAJ wanted the court to reinterpret Articles 59 and 252 of the Constitution, creating a new legal framework that would compel all state officers to obey CAJ directives. This highly charged administrative dispute landed on the desk of a 5-judge Supreme Court bench, led by Chief Justice Martha Koome. The bench reviewed the extensive filings, the constitutional text, and the statutory limits, and they delivered a unanimous response. The Supreme Court entirely rejected the CAJ's request and declined to render the substantive opinion. The justices did not dispute the importance of the Ombudsman's work. Instead, their refusal was a strict defense of the court's own jurisdictional boundaries against an attempt at administrative overreach. To understand why the Supreme Court shut the door on the CAJ, we have to look at how the court processes Article 163(6) requests. Before the justices ever consider the underlying legal question, they run the application through a strict sequence of procedural filters. The first gate is locus standi, evaluating whether the applicant has the legal right to request an advisory opinion. The CAJ clears this hurdle easily. Article 260 of the Constitution defines independent commissions as legitimate state organs, granting proper standing. The inquiry then moves to the second structural filter, subject matter. The Constitution explicitly dictates that a reference from a state organ must concern a matter related to county government. To satisfy this, the CAJ cited unresolved complaints against Mombasa County for unpaid worker benefits and Kisumu County over noise pollution. The Supreme Court reviewed these examples, confirming the dispute involved county governments. The CAJ passed the structural tests, establishing technical jurisdiction. But establishing jurisdiction is only half the battle. Passing these structural filters merely proves the court can hear the case. It does not mean the court should, shifting the evaluation from a question of constitutional right to a matter of judicial discretion. Even with valid standing and subject matter, the Supreme Court reserves the right to refuse an advisory reference to protect its docket from unnecessary litigation. This brings us to the third filter, a mandatory procedural prerequisite. The applicant must demonstrate prior consultation with the Attorney General, who serves as the government's constitutionally designated principal legal advisor. The CAJ followed this rule, sending a formal request for advice regarding their constitutional powers to the Attorney General on March 7, 2025. On March 24, the Attorney General delivered a comprehensive response, confirming a hard reality for the CAJ. While they have the power to investigate, they absolutely do not possess binding adjudicative authority. The Attorney General pointed directly to the statute governing the Commission. Under Section 42(4) of the CAJ Act, if public entities ignore the Ombudsman's recommendations, the legally required remedy is to escalate the matter by reporting the noncompliance to the National Assembly. The advisory concluded with a clear path forward. If the CAJ requires binding power to function effectively, they must draft and propose legislative amendments, rather than seeking a judicial intervention. The Attorney General's response proved that the existing legal framework already provided the CAJ with a clear statutory roadmap for handling defiant agencies. This directly undercut their argument that Supreme Court intervention was their only remaining option. The CAJ received the Attorney General's opinion and formally disagreed with it, precisely because it confirmed their lack of binding power. When the CAJ took this disagreement to the Supreme Court, the justices drew a hard line. They highlighted the critical distinction between being unhappy with an outcome and possessing a demonstrable legal grievance. If a state organ wants to move the Supreme Court after consulting the Attorney General, they must prove exactly why the Attorney General's legal analysis is defective. As the judgment starkly noted, the Supreme Court is not a legal advisor of state organs. The CAJ failed to meet this burden. They offered no concrete legal proof that the Attorney General's interpretation of the CAJ Act or his reading of the Vision 2030 precedent was factually or constitutionally incorrect. The justices recognized a dangerous precedent. If they accepted this reference, they would effectively reduce the apex court to a secondary advice bureau, forced to entertain every state agency that receives an unfavorable legal opinion from the Attorney General. The Supreme Court's advisory jurisdiction is designed to resolve genuine legal ambiguities. It cannot be weaponized as an appellate shortcut to bypass valid, albeit unpopular, advice from the government's chief legal officer. This leads to the fourth and final logic gate, the Ripeness Doctrine, also known as judiciability. In constitutional law, ripeness requires that an agency actually exercises its existing powers and faces a formal, documented denial of access or enforcement before a court will step in to resolve the dispute. The justices examined the specific evidence the CAJ provided regarding local disputes, looking at claims of unpaid hospital bills and worker benefits in Mombasa County. The court found a glaring omission. The CAJ provided no proof that they had actually utilized their statutory enforcement mechanisms against Mombasa. There was no record of them officially escalating the ignored recommendations to the National Assembly. The same pattern appeared with the Judicial Service Commission. After the JSC ignored the initial subpoenas, the CAJ failed to demonstrate that they took any subsequent legal action to penalize that noncompliance. Citing precedents from the Indi and Kahindi cases, the Supreme Court firmly reiterated that it does not render decisions based on hypothetical fears or anticipated future events. An agency cannot ask the court what to do if it hasn't first tried to do its job. Because the CAJ bypassed its own enforcement steps and failed to actually test the limits of its existing statutory powers, the dispute remained entirely abstract. And with that, the final gate to the Supreme Court permanently locked shut. The CAJ's legal maneuver collapsed entirely. Their request was defeated not by the substance of their constitutional arguments, but by their failure to navigate the strict procedural filters of Article 1636. Had the court ignored the Ripeness Doctrine and answered the CAJ's questions, it would have fallen into an abstract trap, effectively dictating step-by-step instructions on how an independent commission should execute its own daily mandate. By refusing the case, the justices protected a core architectural principle of the Kenyan legal system, the separation of powers. The ultimate legal reality remains unchanged. Under the current statutory framework, the Commission on Administrative Justice is strictly an investigatory and recommendatory body. It is not a judicial one. If an administrative watchdog suffers from a lack of adjudicative teeth, the Constitution provides a specific venue for a remedy. It isn't the Supreme Court. To acquire binding legal authority, the CAJ must draft formal legislative amendments and successfully lobby the National Assembly to rewrite the CAJ Act. A Supreme Court advisory opinion is a highly specialized tool for unraveling genuine legal uncertainty. It is not a magic wand designed to bypass the hard, political work of legislative amendment.